Okay, so we left off at Roe versus Wade in the 1970s. Um, and what I want you to be picking up from this is, first of all, the decision about what life is, for the most part, lies in the hands of individual states. Um, because the Supreme Court decides, what is protected by the Constitution, but then says, there is part of the Constitution that says the states have a vested interest in protecting life. So they also have to give enough flexibility to individual states to make some of those decisions. So what life and death is in America varies depending on what state you're in. The other thing I want you to be seeing is that whether it's life or death, which again seem like opposites, but are actually very, very, very closely linked, that decision, for the most part, all goes back to that 14th Amendment and the right to privacy and the due process clause, life or death. It all goes back to what is protected under Americans' privacy. So if you're ever having these conversations with folks and the legal aspect of it comes up, now you know, right? It's not about that whole, we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The fact is that gets a little squidgy based on what state you're in, to what extent you have the right to life or the right to death. So it's really more about we have the right to privacy and what our right to privacy protects. All right, so this one comes up. This is a Planned Parenthood case in 1992, Planned Parenthood of Pennsylvania versus Casey. So the state of Pennsylvania attempts to pass a legislative package which tries to put in place all of these pieces. Doctors are required to inform women about the detriments to their health from abortion, or possible detriments to health from abortion. Women are required to give prior notice to their husbands if they are if they're choosing to terminate. Minors have to get consent from a parent. There's a 24-hour hold. And then there's certain reporting mandates on facilities, like they have to report certain statistics. Okay. This one here, this purple one is highlighted and italicized because this is the only one. So Pennsylvania passes all of these laws and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, whether or not they're constitutional. This one is the only one that the Supreme Court said isn't constitutional. The Supreme Court said, yes, you can do this. Yes, you can do this. Yes, you can do this. And yes, you can do this. But this one you can't do because the idea was that if, for example, a woman was in an abusive relationship and was deciding not to continue that pregnancy because she didn't want to bring a child into that relationship and all of that, that actually revealing to a spouse or significant other that she was making that choice would put her in further jeopardy, and that violates her privacy. So the Supreme Court upheld all these others except this one. And here you have a little bit more information about that case. But what was super interesting, that case also resulted in this notion of undue burden, which they said no state can put into effect an undue burden on a woman seeking to terminate a pregnancy. So here's how they define it: the purpose or effect of placing a substantial obstacle in the path of a woman seeking an abortion of a non-viable fetus. So up to third trimester. And that was interesting. So no state can create undue burden, right? And then we have a lot of other cases that are about undue burden. They also overturned the trimester system. They said, hang on, this whole third trimester deal is no longer usable as far as an idea. And this is a point where if we were in class, I would say, anybody have any idea why? And the answer is because by the 1990s, medicine had advanced so much that we could keep a fetus alive outside the womb earlier, right? So viability is now recognized as 22 to 23 weeks rather than 28 weeks or third trimester used in Roe versus Wade. This is interesting because what this means is that the more medicine advances, the earlier viability gets. And then we start talking about new cases where potentially viability is defined at 20 weeks. And if you look, there are various states. Ohio is one of them. Kentucky is one of them that have tried to put forth legislation that says viability is at 20 weeks. None of them, all of them have been struck down by the Supreme Court, or not even made it that far. But it creates an interesting gray area. They also said that states have an interest in protecting the life of a viable fetus so that they can ban post-viability, so again, that's after this 22 to 23 week mark, abortion, with the exception that carrying to term endangered the life or health of the mother. Now we have this word health that's come into here, right? So most states are required to have laws that have a clause in them that says, like, you can't have an abortion after 23 weeks unless your life is in danger, right? But this is the first time they've put in place that health piece. And now there are a lot of cases in which that becomes critical. So for example, there was one in Ohio where a woman found out that if she carried the pregnancy to term, she would be paralyzed. It was inevitable. And she's 7 months along. So she decides it's an incredibly painful decision for her because it was a wanted pregnancy. She decides she wants to terminate because she can't give that baby a good life. As a paralyzed person, her health would be severely compromised. But the state determined that her life wasn't in danger, just her health. But since it was unlikely that she would actually die, she had to carry to term. So this creates some interesting problems as well. Now, here's where we transition to end-of-life cases and what this whole right to privacy deal has to do with that. Important case, this one was actually in the 80s, started in the 80s. So, Cruzan versus the director of the Missouri Health Department. So, there's a woman who's in a car accident, and her SUV ends up upside down in a creek. So her head is in the water, just enough to essentially drown her. She is revived, but she's in a persistent vegetative state. That's what PVS is. So she's on a feeding tube. Her parents want to remove that feeding tube. They claim that it's what she would have wanted, but there's no evidence of that. There's no written anything, right? So the case goes to court. The doctors refuse, without evidence, the doctors refuse to remove the feeding tube. Case goes to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that the doctors were right, that these parents needed to produce clear and convincing evidence that that's what she wanted, that her right to privacy does not allow for those parents to make that decision. The due process piece of the 14th Amendment was called in here again, but it was decided that that aspect of the Constitution did not give the parents the right to make this decision. This case is interesting because it resulted in the creation of advanced health directives. So that whole notion of choosing a medical proxy and putting a DNR in place and all of those documents that now we're trying to get people to do was unheard of before the Cruzan case. This case brought all those things to light. Interestingly, her parents later were able to provide a diary in which she wrote that something to the effect that if anything ever happened to her, she didn't want to be kept alive on machines. So they were able to demonstrate that she would have wanted to be off the feeding tube, and they eventually removed her from the tube, but not before this case went all the way to SCOTUS. But again, what's interesting here is that it's that notion of privacy and due process that's examined in the context of the argument. Vacco versus Quill in the late 90s was a Supreme Court decision regarding whether or not the Constitution covers your right to die. So New York had banned physician-assisted dying, or physician-assisted suicide, as it's commonly known. And it prevented doctors from assisting their patients who are terminally ill and great pain to help them in dying, right? This case is important because it established that there is no constitutional guarantee of a right to die. Your right to privacy does not cover your right to die, essentially. So here's another one, Washington versus Glucksberg. This whole group of folks a doctor, some patients, and an organization wanted to challenge a law already in place in Washington state that banned assisted suicide. It was called the Natural Death Act. They claimed that it was a liberty interest. It's a freedom protected by the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. So again, the 14th Amendment and the Due Process Clause is being brought up here. SCOTUS says it is not. It is not part of your liberty. It is not protected by the 14th Amendment. Interestingly, though, various states like Oregon, because they can make decisions about life and death and the legislation in that state, that's how we get right to die laws in states like Oregon and California and the ones that have them. Okay, so the big points here, the big takeaways are that this whole discussion about what is the beginning of life and what is the end of life in American legal context goes back to that due process, 14th Amendment, right to privacy, and in some cases, the right to liberty, as we saw in that last one. And individual states get to make individual decisions that govern life and death, and what the definition of life is, and what the definition of death is. I don't know about you, but that leaves me with a really weird feeling, right? Even more conflicted than I have felt previously. It leaves me asking myself questions about, what do I think life is? What does it mean to be a person? What is death? How do I want to define death for myself? Like, what kind of advanced directives might I want in place knowing this, like, about these laws? Do we have a right to certain things in dying? And we know the Supreme Court says we don't have a right to die. We don't have a right to make that decision. Should we have other rights? What should they be? As a caregiver or healthcare provider, how will you help guide folks, again, using narrative ethics? How will you help them make decisions about what is good for them? And also what is good to want for others? How will you do that without internalizing or inflecting your beliefs onto them? These are all questions I want you to consider, and I'm really bummed we didn't get to talk about it together, because this is usually kind of a culminating conversation. And it's kind of a heavy conversation. So I want you to keep thinking about it. Text me, email me if you have thoughts. Maybe you're just relieved to kind of shut down this part of the conversation, and that's okay too. So the last thing that we will be discussing is the Wounded Storyteller Chapter 8, and hopefully that'll start giving some closure to some of these threads we've opened up in the course of the class. So that's already posted. You can go on to that now if you want. So until I see you again, be well and take care of yourselves, and stay 6 feet away from other people, and wash your hands, and love as much as you can. Take care, guys.